All right, welcome back. Next, we have a presentation on Soybeans 101, and that will be provided by Sherri Roberts, a crop extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. Before joining the ministry, Sherri has taught agriculture at the high school and vocational school level, owned her own horticulture consulting and landscape company, and managed several different garden centers. Sherri.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just getting this loaded up here, so give me a second. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm very, very excited about this presentation that I've put together to talk about my favorite subject, which is soybeans. Everything all set there, folks?
Yeah, that looks great, Sherri.
All righty. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to attempt to give to you some tips and tricks on growing soybeans. Soybeans are my favorite topic because growing up in Minnesota, as the introduction said, as everyone knows, Minnesota is a huge soybean state, and I look back fondly upon all the walks that I used to have with my dad as we'd walk our soybean fields, and he'd pick a pod and he'd say, "What do you think? Is it ready to harvest?" And I'd chew on those beans and I'd give him my opinion. So I always look back on soybeans in a very favorable manner, and I really think that it's a crop that has a lot of potential here in this province. We just have to refine our agronomics with it. And with that, let's talk about the fact that one good thing that's happened in the 7.5 years that I've been here in Saskatchewan is Saskatchewan crop insurance. It is now available for soybean crops grown in all parts of the province. It used to be that it was only available down here in the southeast, and then it was certain varieties, and then it expanded as they received more data. And now, thank goodness, if you choose a variety that has the right characteristics for the area in which you are producing here in Saskatchewan, you can get crop insurance coverage. So that soybeans have come a long way in that 7.5 years, because as you know, the actuaries have to do their pencil calculations in order to be able to come up with that conclusion and give that coverage, but now it's happened. So one thing that you do want to keep in mind, though, if you want to work with soybeans in this province and you need crop insurance, and most producers, their financing does require that they have some sort of a crop insurance or risk stability situation figured out. And if you're using crop insurance, you're going to want to look at the 2021 or 2022 terms and conditions that crop insurance has put into effect, and make sure you read those over and make sure that you understand them, because there are some basic principles in there, particularly in their agronomic practices that they talk about, that you're going to want to make sure you understand. And it particularly has to do with some specific agronomics of soybeans and some things that you want to take into consideration. And I will draw your attention to this one right here. The recommended guideline for seeding soybeans is between May 15th and June 5th. And when the average soil temperature at depth of seeding reaches 10 Celsius and the risk of spring frost is minimal. We'll cover some of those reasons why they have those in there, but they say if the crop is seeded too early, spring frost is not an insurable cause of loss. Coverage may be denied where crops are seeded too late to reasonably expect them to reach maturity. So whatever you do, in the next line says inoculants and seed treatments are critical to soybean production in Saskatchewan. And I'll go into that a little bit more in detail a little in this presentation. But if you are considering doing beans, make sure you read these terms and conditions and understand them, because of the agronomics that are somewhat specific to soybeans. The big thing with soybeans, and I know some of the other producers have already talked about this, is average precipitation by month. And the big thing you need to look at when you're looking at growing soybeans is July and August. And somebody says, well, why do we have to worry about that? Because there's a significant yield decrease if you do not get your moisture in July and August, as those flowers are coming out and the pods are beginning to form. Just this year when I was out surveying soybeans, I don't know how many, and the Southeast received quite a bit of moisture this year. We had some areas where we were deficient, and in those areas had some soybean growers, and you could see how the flowers had aborted right on the plants. And it's a very sad situation, and it will nail your yield big time. But as you can see here, the Melfort area, you get plenty of moisture on average, and we'll say on average, in the months of July and August, where you can get good pod set, good flower set, good pod set, and then in return end up with some nice yields. Because what happens, the other thing that we had this year, and we never say the D word, we say heat stress and dryness, is this study was done by Ramona Moore out of Manitoba, and if you want to see more of it, you can go into the Manitoba Pulse Beat at the Manitoba soybean website. But this is the big critical time. If you're in the R2 or full flower, which is, as I said, mid-July, and you don't get enough moisture and you get those really hot days like we had this year, you're going to lose your flowers, as I said, and you're also going to get a shorter flowering period. Then if that dryness or extreme heat hits at early pod, which is generally late July, you are going to abort those flowers in the pods. Like I said, you could see out in the fields this year. If the shortage comes at early to mid-August, you're going to have a real big effect on your pod elongation and your seed development. So you're going to have the number of pods per plant reduced. You're going to have the number of seeds per pod reduced, and your seed size is going to be reduced. And then if that dryness or real extreme heat hits at the full seed, which is generally late August, your seed size is going to get reduced. So once again, that is the critical thing on growing soybeans. When are we going to have moisture available? And it's so funny because if you look at the Saskatchewan Atlas, we have enough growing time over in the Southwest where they could grow soybeans. In fact, they can grow soybeans very well under the irrigated land in the Southwest. The only problem is it's that dryness generally hits in latter part of July into August. Like even some of the soybean growers down here, I know there's a certain gentleman at Hallbright, he seems to have just his luck, I don't know. I don't recommend that he ever goes to Vegas because it just seems like in the last few years down here in July and August, he's just been hit with dryness, and it has definitely affected his yields. But the other thing you want to think about with soybeans that isn't as big a consideration, in fact, it really isn't a consideration at all with the other pulse crops, is when is that last frost date in spring? Because unlike all the other pulses that keep their growing point down below the ground, a soybean, once it's emerged out of the ground, that growing point is right there. And we all know once that growing point is up above the ground, it becomes susceptible to a frost, and that's why they have the frost dates hooked up with crop insurance. But as you can see here, you end up in that May 22nd to May 28th frost period. And growing up in Minnesota, my dad usually put the corn in the ground the first 2 weeks in May. After that, he followed with the soybeans. And in some years, we still had snowflakes falling at Memorial Weekend, which is, if you're not familiar with the United States, is the last weekend in May generally. So somewhat, it's not only dependent on the date for that last frost, but your planting should also be dependent on what your soil conditions are. And as it said in that crop insurance thing, they should be at least 10 degrees Celsius before you think about putting that pea in the ground, or the soybean seed in the ground. Otherwise, you're going to end up with that seed sitting there. It's not going to start its germination. And when a seed sits in the ground and it's cold ground, you make it extremely susceptible to disease. And as I said there, June 5th is the final seeding deadline for soybeans for if you want to qualify for SCIC crop insurance coverage. So if you are planning on putting some soybeans into your rotation this year, think about that. And listening to the prices the other day, they're at $15 a bushel right now on the marketplace. So I certainly do believe that there is a place for them. And while there's a lot of competition for some other crops, producers have got, and I cannot stress this strong enough, you've got to be stretching out your rotations. If you have any sort of vision at all, you look down the pike and you see some of the things that are happening in the world and some of the restrictions that are coming on in other countries on their farming techniques. We don't want that to happen here in Canada. So we've got to be looking at how we're handling our crops, how we're widening out our rotations, how we're dealing with our disease and insect issues, how we're doing with our harvest techniques, and telling ourselves, if we can keep doing it the right way, we're not going to have somebody coming along and telling us this is the way you have to do it, because we've already been doing it the right way all along. The other thing we have to think about, of course, is that fall frost. And I know right now from looking at the crop insurance SMP data, and if you've never looked at the SMP data, it's on the website, and it's their Saskatchewan management. And it goes into all the different crops that are grown in the different crop zones, and it goes into the yields that they get. And I can see somebody's been growing Watson up there in the Melfort area. They've been doing fairly well with it, except you got hit by that early frost the other year, and that really nailed your yields, and that can happen. And a lot of that also, once again, gets back to the varietal selection that you do and getting your planting done at the proper time in the spring. And to me, I think the number one factor when you're growing soybeans is your varietal selection, because there's so many things that are tied up into that. Some people don't realize it, but varietal selection, you can make or break yourself with a crop. I can remember my husband used to tell the story about when canola first came out there. And of course, it was kind of put into the marketplace before some of the yield data was there, so that you had the larger yields, and guys jumped into it, and they had some real crashes. And my husband said he remembered being in a bank, and one of the bankers said to one of the producers, just don't be growing any more of that sample rape at the 8 to 10 bushels to the acre. Well, the same things has happened with soybeans. Soybeans were introduced into this province, I think, a little bit too early. Some of the varieties weren't quite there yet for handling the conditions of the first frost and last frost in this province. And some boundaries were pushed. And I had now, even in the southeast, where it is an ideal area down here to be growing soybeans, I run into producers that say, nope. Tried that 10 years ago, not going, it was a crash, not going there again. And ask yourself, step back and think, well, if I had thought like that when canola first came out there, and we had those crashes with those first varieties canola where they just weren't yielding properly, I didn't give up on canola, and I don't think people should be giving up on soybeans. I will always be adamant and enthusiastic about soybeans. Everybody knows I'm sort of the soybean gal with the ministry. And I'm the one person who does most of the soybean surveying in this province for diseases, particularly with the ministry. And it's just something that I'm passionate about. I think that they really have a fit here, and some of the new varieties that are out there now really show that there is a fit. And if you haven't looked at the varieties of grain crops for your varieties, Dale talked about it in a little bit in his presentation. It's the go-to guide. And I'm not going to say Saskatchewan's the only variety of grain crop booklet you should be looking at up in your neck of the woods. I would certainly be downloading and looking at Manitoba's book too, because of course their soybean acres are way up there compared to ours, and they have been doing varietal testing for so many more years, and they have so much more data on some of these. And I also am going to challenge some of you there. How many of you have actually been over to the varietal testing site at Melfort? You know, if we were in person, you could raise your hands and I'd know. Yep.
Sherri, you just have a couple minutes.
Yep, almost done. So anyway, look at those, go to those sites, look at those varietal trials and find out. And thank goodness Sask Pulse puts a lot of funding into that. So this is rural research. You're going to want to know, go over there once or twice a season and look to see how the different varieties react. And as you can see, here's your data. And look, as Dale already talked about the maturity groupings, so I won't go over that. There also are conventional varieties, and people say, why in the world would you want to grow a conventional soybean variety? Trust me, I'm of an age, there was no such thing as a Roundup Ready soybean variety when I was growing up. We only had conventional, and they can yield very well. The other thing is inoculate. The other big thing is an inoculant for soybeans is not the same kind of an inoculant as you use for any of the other pulses. So get the specific inoculant you need and treat that inoculant well. Don't throw it up on the dashboard of the truck and let it sit there in the heat and in the cool. Treat it like you treat a grandchild. Disease management. We had 15 fields this year that were tested in our soybean diseases, and guess what? Every single one of them came back. Every field was contaminated with a certain type of fusarium, and as you can see here, some had even more than just one type of fusarium. So definitely use seed treatments, you're going to give that seed its best to start off. Planter or drill, we already know that a planter does give a little bit more of an edge on planting soybeans because of the fact that it treats the seed a little bit kinder. Be very, very careful in treating your soybean seed. Don't be banging it around. Don't be putting it through any kind of a mechanical thing that can crack that seed, because then you just leave openings for disease. And watch your rotations, because of course we all know that soybeans are susceptible to sclerotinia stem rot. So don't be putting it before or after canola. You could create yourself a big mess, a crash. And if you have any other questions, here's my contact information. And as I said, anybody that wants to talk soybeans, please give me a call, because I am always willing to talk about my favorite crop. Thank you.
All right, we know who's fired up about soybeans. Thank you, Sherri, for your presentation. And let's be sure to have some soybean questions for Sherri in the Q&A box. We're going to switch gears a bit now and turn our attention to the topic of carbon advocacy. Our next presentation will provide an update on this topic presented by Patrick Kennedy, who is a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. Patrick is currently working with SPG and other crop commissions to develop and execute an advocacy strategy regarding federal and provincial environmental policies and the role that agriculture can play in emissions reduction. Looking for an update on this, Patrick. Please proceed.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for that introduction. Are we able to see my screen? Did I nail the sharing?
You nailed it, Patrick. It looks great.
All right, practice makes perfect on that. It's great to be here with everybody virtually from Ottawa. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I will, I'll look to be brief. I know you've got a great series of presentations in front of you today, and I'm sure the Q&A is where we'll want to focus our time. And while others have, like Sherri, have fortunately focused on the fantastic and fascinating crop-related agricultural details, as was said, I'll take us to a different part of agriculture and look for a couple of moments at the politics on the issue and the advocacy around it. Let me spend just a second first introducing Earnscliffe so you know where I'm coming from. Then my plan is to speak about the overall political environment with a focus on federal government. That's where my expertise is. Then I'll chat a bit about advocacy and navigating and hopefully influencing, as was said, environmental policy regarding agriculture. Earnscliffe Strategies is a public affairs and strategic advisory firm specializing in government relations, strategic communications, and polling. We're about 30 years old, and we operate from 4 offices across Canada, including Saskatchewan, and we have affiliates in about 50 countries globally. And as was said, I have the pleasure of working with Carl and some of the other crop commissions in Saskatchewan, providing counsel and support regarding advocacy on environmental issues, and we will get to that a bit more later on. Let me give a brief update of what's happening in the federal political space, and I'm sure you all watch the news, so I'm going to try to move beyond headlines, but it's really important as context for what's moving and how it's moving, both on agricultural and environmental policy, because these are 2 of the most fundamentally, I would say, political issues rather, or issue sets or areas of policy that are currently active. And it's also really important, this political background is a scene setter to discuss advocacy. And we've got to acknowledge that both agriculture and environment are within both federal and provincial government jurisdictions, but I will spend most of my time focusing federally. And I should give the disclaimer that my comment should be viewed as neutral. I'm politically agnostic, which owes at least partly to the fact that as government relations consultants, we have to play well in the sandbox with whomever is in government. So that's where I'm coming from today. Since the Trudeau government's second election in 2019, almost everything in its plans has been knocked off course by COVID-19. And every time the government attempted to get back on track, it was another wave of or series of events seemed to take over. So as we look to see what may happen in the near term on agriculture and on environment and other issues, unfortunately, these COVID concerns continue to frame what this new winter parliamentary session may look like. And I've got my presentation off to the side, so if you see me looking over here, it's just to look at the where I can see the slides. The the government is desperately, especially since this last election, trying to get back on track and actually govern and make policy, as opposed to just being in responsive mode. Climate change was a major priority of the election. This is consistent with the last couple of mandates as well. If anything, it's becoming more central and more prominent, I would say, as we move ahead. Since the election, the key message to be taken out of what's happened with government is slow. Government pursued a really slow restart to its activities for a variety of reasons. I think one is they're really struggling 6 years into their mandates to staff. Also, of course, various events knocking them off course, but the cabinet was slow to be named, and Parliament was slow to be recalled. As a result, the federal budget, our next big political event, likely pushed out until late March or early April as well. So things are really grinding along. The other thing that is happening that allows the government to take its time is significant turmoil in the opposition. And in fact, just up the street right at this moment, Mr. O'Toole's caucus is voting on whether or not to keep him as leader. So that allows the government a little more latitude to slow down and take its time with things. Of course, the new cabinet that was unveiled in October, again, 5 weeks after the election, very few ministers kept their previous portfolios. And of course, of particular interest to this group, I think, environment was the big change. A new activist minister in the environment to deliver on the government's commitments of getting to net zero. Very little change in other relevant portfolios: trade, innovation, science and economic development, and of course in agriculture. And the lack of change in agriculture is getting mixed reviews. I think some stakeholders were looking for the opportunity to forge new relationships in that area. The parliamentary dynamics that exist right now in a minority government means the government has got to find a dance partner to get any of its legislative priorities through the House, through the Senate. So while they will be trying to pivot away from COVID response and get back to some of the legislation that this group in particular, I think, would be interested in, its ability to do that is always going to be dependent on finding those who will support their agenda, namely in the NDP, the Conservatives, or the Bloc. Here's a quick snapshot of where we are today. Nothing super surprising this far after an election. Nobody is particularly happy with any of their options. You've got a pretty even ranking of the parties across the board if the election were to be held today. The likelihood that there will be new leaders in some of these parties before the next election, mutes the importance of this, but we always keep our eye on whether any party is surging ahead of the others, because that could influence how long a minority parliament really will last. A quick snapshot of some of the key dates that we're keeping our eyes on in terms of, again, where there are opportunities to influence legislation or policy that can impact the ag sector. The pre-budget consultations were just launched this past week as Parliament came back for its winter session. And as I said, we'll be looking to that late March, early April budget for a strong indication of what this government will hope to accomplish in the rest of its mandate. Issues to watch are, again, the point I'm just trying to drive home here is they're almost exclusively environmental in nature. This is really where the government is going to be putting its shoulder in and trying to make serious progress before the next election. I think to this list, I would add global supply chain challenges, which I know is something that is top of mind for this sector as well. But that continues to impact the country's ability to recover economically from the pandemic. On agricultural issues specifically, there's kind of been a hodgepodge of minor announcements since the election. Nothing probably to write home about just yet, other than the fact that the next policy framework, the new ag policy framework, is obviously underway. Consultations open now, and I think the government's looking to come to ground on that at some point this spring. I won't go through environmental policy in detail, but again, this is just with a goal of outlining how many moving pieces there are in this particular sphere of government policy right now. And what Carl and I speak about frequently with the other commissions is that there is not a lot of synchronicity just yet to how these things are moving forward together. These are policy initiatives kind of announced in isolation, all with a kind of a vague goal of helping the government achieve the net zero goal. but they're just now starting to work on the details of where these policies work together and consulting stakeholders on where there are opportunities for council, for involvement, and where unintended consequences need to be mitigated. Stepping down one level of detail into environmental policy that I think specifically impacts this sector, there are a number of processes underway, a number of policies currently being considered that I think the sector will want to ensure its voice is heard on. I think whatever the best intentions of officials and political staff in Ottawa, as I know you will appreciate, often the evolution of a sector such as agriculture has taken place outside the eyes of government, and they need a better understanding of how potential policies can impact the sector. That takes me to just a couple of moments worth of comments on advocacy and kind of how that political context and the knowledge of what government wants to accomplish can translate into action for the sector. I would say generally government is constantly faced with a barrage of stakeholder engagement. It almost always comes with asks or demands or frustration and anger and little constructive input. So I think all public policy is political. Governments are living in the eye of media and need to be seen to be making progress on their agendas, and that's acutely true in a minority parliament like the one we have right now. The last three federal governments under Prime Minister Trudeau, but even the preceding government under Prime Minister Harper, have really come to the realization that environmental policy is not just an inevitable central element of a national government, but there is potential domestic and global competitiveness advantages to come out of good environmental policy as well. So this belief has definitely taken on new fervor over the last 5 years, but it's unlikely that the issue will dissipate. I'd say there's an unresolved tension between agriculture and environment that I find to be very different than the tension faced by other industrial sectors, which are also facing environmental regulation. And as I said a moment ago, I think while ag as a sector has undergone such huge modernization and technological implementation, it's done so out of the eyes of policymakers. And this, I think, has led to a lack of awareness about what's being done on farm and then what's actually possible to achieve with existing technology and increasing demands for production as well. So this is where thoughtful, purposeful advocacy becomes, I think, so important, both for better policy making and also for ensuring that agriculture has an environment that's conducive to success and of being part of the solution. So just that the last point I think I would make is I suggest a pretty simple framework for thinking about how to better engage with government, really on anything substantive, to proactively grab a seat at the table, determine where there's alignment or misalignment with government, find where your sector and your issue stances are aligned with what government's trying to achieve. That's the first step in opening a channel for dialogue. Identify where there's misalignment and if it's the government that needs to move or the sector that needs to move. And in either case, ensure that you're positioned as government, to government as a resource. Then develop positions that help the government accomplish what it wants while avoiding consequences that adversely impact your sector. And then you start what is often a long and pretty slow climb to communicating these positions and coming up with a compelling narrative and ideas that convey an understanding of this political context we've just talked about and where the sector's work can be an asset for the government of the day, and then deliver messages and follow up and build a coalition of support. I think the last point I would make is just that in terms of advocacy and engagement, responsiveness is key. Be prepared to put in the time to make sure messages are heard. And again, this is what Carl and the other commissions are really putting a lot of time into. But also be prepared to pivot. As we're seeing right now, as I mentioned up the street, political context changes frequently. And there has to be flexibility. Got to be ready to educate and re-educate as players change, to engage with both the political staff and officials. They're both working on policy together, and to find a way to measure progress. And that's maybe one of the trickiest parts. This is anything around advocacy, particularly around environment, is a long game that is really, really difficult to quantify. I think I'll leave it there.
That was great, Patrick. Thank you for your presentation. Let's make sure we get our carbon sequestration advocacy questions in for Patrick. So
Great.
Our next session is focused on a new vision for pulse breeding in Saskatchewan, and this presentation will be provided by Carl Potts, Executive Director for SPG, and Shaun Dyrland, our Board Chair with SPG. And please, fellas, let's not hold back on any good questions for these two. Let's go, Carl and Shaun.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Terry. I just want to confirm you can see my slides and audio is okay.
Yeah, everything looks.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, we would want to provide a bit of an update in terms of what's happening on the breeding side of things. SPG has a long history in being involved in supporting post-crop breeding over the years, and you know, times are changing, so we're going to provide a bit of an update there. Since the late 1990s, SPG has had a long-term breeding relationship with the Crop Development Center at the University of Saskatchewan and has received royalty-free access to post-crop varieties that were developed by the CDC. It's been a valuable partnership for Saskatchewan producers, and well-adapted varieties developed by the CDC have really been a significant driver of growth for pulse production here in the province. Farmers have made major investments in pulse crop breeding and related research over that time period. From 1997 to 2020, SPG invested more than $40 million in core funding for pulse breeding at the CDC. Annual contributions increased from under $500,000 per year in the first years to approximately $5 million per year in the latest years of those agreements. And in addition to the core breeding investments, SPG invested over $20 million in targeted genetics and genomics projects at the CDC over that same time period. And as a result of this partnership, SPG has released over 130 CDC pulse varieties royalty-free to Saskatchewan producers since 1997. And with a successful model for breeding and variety development, you know, some people are asking why things are changing. So there's a few reasons why things are changing. The most recent SPG CDC breeding agreement was for 15 years and started in 2005. SPG was interested in continuing with a similar arrangement in 2020, which would provide CDC with stable and predictable funding and growers with royalty-free access to varieties. However, CDC did not wish to continue that agreement. CDC indicated that they wanted to move to a model that's similar to what they have for other crops, where they have multiple funding partners and can generate revenue for their programs through royalties for new varieties that they would release. So really, once it became clear that the existing model that we preferred wouldn't be possible, SPG began to look at alternate ways that we can make investments for breeding for the benefit of Saskatchewan producers. And in the meantime, SPG is providing funding for pea, chickpea, dry bean breeding projects at the CDC over a 3-year period. So changing times call for changing models. Since the 1990s, when SPG and CDC established this model of breeding partnership, a lot has changed. There's been considerable growth in post-crop acres in Canada, and especially in Saskatchewan. There's been changes in recent years to plant breeders' rights legislation that create a greater ability for breeders to capture value from variety development. The opportunities and challenges that we need to tackle with breeding have become more complex. For example, we have complex root disease issues, the need for additional herbicide tolerances in lentils, and changing end-use customer requirements. In addition, there's new technologies that are being applied to traditional breeding approaches as well. So as we look forward to the future, we expect that producers will pay for access to new varieties through royalties, just like you do for other crops, such as wheat. This will be one of the reasons why we want to stay involved in any future breeding as having a seat at the table when decisions are being made and priorities are being set. So in short, a number of things have changed that require that new breeding models and new approaches are needed for pulse breeding for the future. However, while the model may be changing in the future, we want to assure producers that the varieties that have been released by SPG that you're currently growing and the varieties that will be released in 2022 will remain royalty-free for producers. So that part isn't changing. So I want to turn it over now to our board chair, Shaun, to talk a little bit about our vision for breeding for the future. So over to you, Shaun.
Thank you very much, Carl. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. When we look to what we want to do in the future, there are a few adjustments we're making. We want to have even greater focus on the outcomes that are the greatest impact for producers. We are transitioning away from the untargeted core funding for breeding programs and shifting to funding targeted outcome-based projects or collaborations to achieve important outcomes for Saskatchewan growers. We've redefined our R&D strategy to focus on the things that are highest priority for producers. These long-term objectives are for breeding include root rot disease, herbicide tolerance in lentils, broader adaptability for smaller use crops, as well as agronomic practices that improve end-use quality of pulses. When we decided on this new approach, there's a couple of key principles that our board has developed that will guide our investments and partnerships moving forward. First, we're approaching this with an investor mindset. There has to be a return on investment for growers. The board has been clear that if SPG is going to invest grower levy dollars up front, and if growers will pay a royalty on new varieties, then a portion of those royalties will need to flow back to SPG for reinvestment back into research, market development, and other areas. Secondly, there'd have to be value sharing with growers in the pricing of new varieties SPG is involved in funding. We want to avoid a situation where these new varieties are priced in a way that most of the incremental value for growers is captured in the cost of the seeds. Without these principles, SPG will not invest. Our involvement in funding pulse crop breeding is to ensure Saskatchewan growers have access to the best possible genetics for continued competitiveness. We remain open to partnering with CDC on pulse breeding, and there's no doubt that our partnership over the last 25 years has helped make Saskatchewan a global pulse powerhouse. We're excited about the future for pulse breeding and the ability to partner with a number of private and public organizations to develop the best possible genetics for Saskatchewan producers. We're also excited about the potential to attract new investment into pulse breeding here in Saskatchewan. So I guess in summary, there's a lot changing in SPG's approach to pulse breeding. We're excited about new partnerships and new investments that we can continue to deliver value for producers in the future. We look forward to talking in more detail about some of these new partnerships very soon. And I think that's all that I have.
Yeah, so back over to you, Terry.
Okay, thanks, guys. We're a little out of schedule. I guess we were expecting more out of you two, but that's good. We'll have a little longer question period. I'm sure there's a variety of topics there to dive into. So thank you for your presentations, Carl and Shaun. Our next session and our last session for the day, a pea and Faba bean market outlook from Marlene Boersch, owner and managing partner at Mercantile Consulting Venture Inc. Marlene co-founded Mercantile, a professional services company specializing in private label market intelligence, risk management solutions, and project consulting. Welcome, Marlene.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me and do you see my screen?
Sounds good.
Looks great.
So I'm very pleased to be here today and talk about peas and faba beans on this frigid day. It's maybe a good day to start planning and to think about the markets, well, for the remaining market for this year and for next year. So let me figure out how to forward. There we go. We'll very briefly talk about what I call outside factors, things not directly from the agricultural side that affects our markets. And then we look at our domestic pulse production and supply and what it means for the remaining year in combination with the pulses produced internationally for peas and faba beans. And that should help us with planning and thinking about the markets as we move forward. So last year, we were still fighting COVID at this time, and to our surprise, I think we're still at it. And we had some very unusual conditions in the markets. And climate change obviously made inroads in Saskatchewan as well. And we had some major reductions in yields and so on. And supply chain logistics were affected very greatly by both of these factors. And I think we're still very much suffering from that, especially with the commodities that are dependent on the container traffic. And sadly, I think that's going to be with us into the coming year as well. So what are we expecting for this year? What is ahead for this year? Well, as you see, I said, fewer COVID disruptions, question mark, still with us, but I think hopefully the waves are waning. We can already say that weather is likely to continue to be adverse, and I'm thinking of some of the dry areas in North America that are affecting our production areas, and certainly what we're seeing in South America, which is now affecting values for feed grains and oilseeds, as in corn and faba beans, and that has an effect, as you know, for example, on feed peas and the use rate of feed peas. Inflationary pressures are increasing, and everybody is now talking about that. And what that does is increase demand uncertainty. And you are feeling that obviously in preparation for new crop with higher farm input costs and on the export side with very, very expensive shipping rates. We have seen a drop in egg prices. Well, I shouldn't actually say a drop. We have seen various waves in the prices. But we can say that behind that is a significant pent-up consumer hedging. And we also think there's some pent-up demand because stocks are actually lower than they were in the last several years. So we're starting from a position of low stocks, and that as well increases volatility. So as we see weather developments here at home and in other countries, we know that prices will react very, very quickly and very hard because we do not have the stock cushion, as I said. So there are also some other outside factors that we monitor more longer term. For example, which are the biggest buyers and which buyers can afford to buy our products. There are some very big changes going on with those countries, juggling for position of the primary buyer. As you know, and we again have seen that in peas very much with China coming to the forefront, and that will continue to affect us. In terms of growth prospects, well, we are stuck probably around 3% GDP increases. There are some much better numbers for some of the emerging and developing economies. And again, that will determine what we schedule for the demand prospects for the coming year. This picture I just wanted to quickly flash by to show how much higher, at a how much higher level we are starting with agricultural prices already this year versus last year. So we have seen very significant increases in prices. And in order to go higher from current prices, you need fresh input into that. So again, that's something to keep in mind. But the most important graph in terms of surrounding factors for us is this one, because it shows us that the aggregate stocks use ratios for the 12 most important grains have actually dropped in the last 7 years, which again, feeds into that idea of very, very high volatility for prices into the coming year as we go forward. So with that, let's talk about peas specifically. And here is just a reminder as to how far we have come since 1980 in terms of pea production in Saskatchewan. And also on the right-hand side, I'm showing you, get some of the stuff out of the way, I'm showing you how much production dropped over the last year, which obviously had a big influence on price as well. And also the caption says an important factor when we look at the marketing side, that when we look at international pea trade, Canada supplies 25 to 28% of the traded peas in the world market. It also shows you faba beans at the bottom. Just in comparison, it's a very, very small crop at this point in time. but I think it has a bright future here as well. And we'll talk about the faba beans as we go forward. Again, I'm trying to forward these, so we do it on this side. Let's review some of the P numbers for the past year, so we have an idea as to where we are with the remaining Ps that you might still have on your farm. You know, as I just mentioned, production was down very seriously this year, and you can see I circled here on the right-hand side production, supply numbers, exports, and carry out for the ongoing year. On the left-hand side, these are the Mercantile numbers, and these are the Stats Canada numbers, which vary a little bit. But really, the basis of the story is that we only had around 2.3 million tons in terms of pea production this year compared to 4.6 million tons the previous year. So that took the market by surprise to some degree. And in terms of supply numbers, we are down to about 2.8 million tons from 4.9 the previous year. Prices reacted actually relatively slowly compared to the lentil prices, and that's because there were quite a few peas under production and particularly these were feeding into some of the bulk sales that we had into China. But since then, prices have been fairly stable, around $18 for yellows and $16 for green peas, until we saw the recent reductions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What about the global supply? As I said, we're very important in the global picture, so was there anybody else that could actually have made up for the losses in North America, because the combined US-Canadian production was down by about 2.7 million tons, which is quite significant. So global production, and that's shown here on the right-hand side, went from around 14.9 million tons to 12.6 million tons. And that's reflecting mostly the reduction in North America. There were some increases in the EU and in the Ukraine, but combined they only made up about 200,000 tons. And obviously it didn't make up for the big reduction we saw here. One other producer, though, I would like to point out, and that is Russia. And you can see them on the graph right here. And Russia produced around 2.7 million tons last year again, which is about the same they had the previous year. And for the first time ever, I think, Russia had a bigger production of peas than Canada. So that actually increases their status internationally as a potential exporter, and has also obviously aroused the interest by China to some degree, although there's still some barriers to Black Sea, meaning Ukrainian and Russian peas in terms of phytosanitary agreements and things like that. But again, you know, it's the first time that Russia actually superseded in pea production to the Canadian production. I'd like to move to the demand side a little bit and emphasize the changes we have seen on the demand side, or the domestic component on the demand side over the last number of years. And in this pie chart here on the right-hand side, you see that the demand side, domestic demand side, comprised a relatively small share of the total usage pie, and export still occupied about 87%. And when you fast forward to 2020, 21, and 21, 22, you can see that the export component of overall demand has actually fallen to about 72%. And that is due to increased pet food and fractioning demand domestically here and in the United States as well. That's a very positive development because it stabilizes demand. And when you think about this year's market, we were benefiting from that all the way into January, because that was one of the major markets we had, and that was a market that could also pay up to the somewhat higher levels, price levels that we have seen. I would say that right now we calculate 800 to 850,000 tons of domestic demand. Export demand is relatively stable. The fluctuating factor on the exporting side is really the demand for feed, and we'll talk about that in a second. So total demand for peas is quite solid, between 3.5 and 4.5 million tons, and we see that going forward as well. In terms of export demand to date, We only have data into the end of November from StatScan by destination, and we ended up with about 920,000 tons shipments until that time, which is down quite severely from the 1.54 million tons we had shipped by that time last year. And you can see here is a graph showing you the demand by destination, and the brown cone shows you this year's shipments into the end of November compared to last year's. So you can see that the big shift lies with China. Last year, China imported 73% of all exported peas from Canada went to China. And this year, that percentage to the end of November shrunk to 68%. And most notably in November, it had shrunk to only 19%, meaning that we were not able to make any additional sales into the feed market in China following the forward sales that we had already done. That is due to several factors. First of all, peas, and we look at a table at the very end of the pea section. The relative value of protein for peas shifted a little bit up relative to soybean meal and relative also to feed wheat. We had difficulties accumulating enough tonnage for bulk shipments, and bulk freight had also become much more expensive. Exports to Bangladesh are also down, but here I would point out that oftentimes we ship the biggest tonnages to Bangladesh January forward. So we might still see some shipments there, but we have seen competition by relatively cheap desi chickpeas into Bangladesh from Australia, for example. One country where exports have increased significantly, and I alluded to that earlier, is exports to the United States are up 7-fold over last year, which is very, very significant. This went into pet food markets, into the fractioning market. And of course, the domestic production in the US, as we mentioned, was down very, very significantly because of the drought as well. I'd also point out that the US has imported about 20,000 tons of peas from the Ukraine, which is the first ever as well, because Ukrainian peas were priced somewhat cheaper than the Canadian peas. Another important point to take with us into next year is that exports to all other destinations, excluding China, are actually up and not down. So we had solid demand from all of the other destinations, which are food pea destinations. So it is really the feed factor that we must worry about into the coming year. This shows you exports by destination. It's a stacked graph. And I wanted to point out what happened to India. India is virtually down to zero imports in terms of peas, which has to do with their domestic policies and trying to keep their pulse prices palatable for their agricultural producers. And we had the great fortune that at the same time, exports to China actually increased significantly. And some of that is the feed sector, as I pointed out earlier. For this ongoing year, we have reduced our export projections to China to only 1 million tons. And as you can see here, all other destinations are basically holding their own this year in terms of demand. So what does that mean for the remainder of the 21-22 year? Because we have seen some price reductions lately. I think a lot of the reduction in price has to do with difficulties with freight, because we are dependent on some of the edible side to import in with containers, and that has proven to be still extremely difficult. So we have adjusted our export projection to about 2.2 million tons for this year, which includes the 1 million ton to Regina, and I think to China. And I think this is a very defendable number, because we already shipped 630,000 tons from August into November into China, the first 4 months of the crop year. Given this somewhat more modest export projection, that should keep ending stock somewhere at 100 to 150,000 tons. And that still is a small 4 to 5% stock use ratio. So it is not the case that we have an overabundance of peas for the remaining year. And This price level should actually be supportive of present levels, but we do need to be able to ship the peas into the export destinations. So in terms of the current market for the peas is that exports have been somewhat slower than normal because we haven't been doing the bulk shipments. And that is due to China not topping up the earlier feed pea purchases. In fact, they sold some of the earlier purchases back into the food market for fractioning. And that's why we have seen very, very little follow-up in terms of purchases from China. I would say that after the New Year celebration, it could well be that China will have to top up a little bit for this year. Noteworthy is, however, that the other destinations that are pointed up have exported actually more year to date than they did last year. So demand by the food destination actually stays intact, and we will end up with a relatively small, roughly 5% stock use ratio at the end of this crop year. So it's hard to rationalize while prices have been falling, other than the momentum is gone from the US buyers for the pet food market and for fractioning, which seemed to be covered until well after spring and into the early summer. So when we look at 2022, what do we expect from the pea side? And it was very interesting to me to see the presentation by Dale Rizzulo, who had some very good and interesting numbers in there. And he was projecting that the return for pulses was actually higher than some of the other crops. And it will be interesting to revisit those numbers. I'm well aware they differ greatly by farm and greatly by area. But this is a stab at coming up with a generalized cost of production scenario with the latest prices that we can fix for a big range of products, as I'm showing you on the left-hand side here. And obviously, those numbers will vary with some of the assumptions, as in yield achievable, as in prices in your area, and the cost side, which will generate the margins. But what I was interested in a generalized return per acre scenario, trying to anticipate also some of the much increased cost side, is given today's prices that we would be able to fix for new crop, how do these crops stack up? And what I see is that actually the pulses lag some of the other commodities, like specifically durum, flaxseed, canola, very important, and oats, and even soybeans, because prices for soybeans to growers for new crop have recently gone up as well. I don't put in extra numbers for the benefits in terms of nitrogen levels. Sorry, it keeps jumping. So the role of the cost of nitrogen, I put at the bottom here, question mark. Certainly there's some follow-up benefits to that as well. But these kind of things are very, very important when we think about acreage projections for next year, which is the first step to understand if you're going to be oversupplied or undersupplied, and trying to anticipate the effect on the prices. The conclusion I came to is that acres might be down 3% because of the relative prices that are fixable right now. And I should point out that Agriculture and Agri-Food in their report last week came to a much different conclusion, because they said pea acres might increase by almost 7% because, quote, of good returns relative to other crops, unquote. So obviously, I posted here both of our opinions. There's a little bit of a difference of opinion what acres will do. And then, of course, we have to pay close attention to what yields we can achieve and what the weather and moisture conditions will be next year. So on the left-hand side in green, these are my forecast numbers, and I'm contrasting them in black with AFC's for your perusal. In terms of exports, we think we can go back to 2.6 million tons, whereas agriculture and agri-food is actually talking about 3 million tons. And that, in my opinion, will entirely depend on what is going to happen to China. And we'll revisit that. In any case, in both scenarios, the stock use ratio remains fairly low. And I would say that prices should be well supported at the 13 mark per bushel level or more, realizing that the bid prices for new crop have actually gone down a little bit. But a lot centers around the opinion on acres and the publication that AFC thinks they will go up by almost 7%. I wanted to talk about the importance of exports there, and here are our pea export projections for the ongoing crop year. I mentioned we only use 1 million for China. For next year, I've increased that to 1.5 million tons because I think with increasing prices on the soybeans and corn side, they might find peas for feed much more interesting again in the coming year. But we'll have to see, and we'll have to monitor what's happening in South America with their production there, because that will have a big influence on this. I just wanted to leave you here with something that we need to monitor, and that's the relative value of protein. And I'm showing here peas versus soybeans and peas versus wheat. On the left-hand side, I made these calculations on January 18th, and then I made these ones on the right-hand side today, February 2nd, 22. And you can see that the value of pea protein relative to soybeans, relative to feed wheat, have actually decreased already, which is why I'm thinking that we will be shipping increased volumes of peas to China again in the coming year. So that's going to be a very, very important thing to monitor for next year, and I'm quite optimistic on the markets there. One rider, it's still very, very dry. On the left-hand side, you have the drought monitor by AFC as of December 31st, which obviously has lots of room for concern. And the precipitation, as shown by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, September 1 to January 31st this year. So again, you know, that certainly will have an important influence as to how the market will develop. I can see I have to hurry up a little bit on my faba bean side. Here you see the faba bean production over the last number of years, 1990 forward, and what happened last year with the reduced yields that all crops suffered from. And you can see that faba bean production has remained to be pretty volatile over that time period, but is increasing. I wanted to leave you with some numbers on that, and the colored boxes on the right-hand side show you the production stocks or supply numbers and the carryover. And you have here the more official numbers on our own numbers, because they differ a little bit, particularly when we go into next year. And you can see that it has been difficult to have a sustained growth on faba beans, and I think that has to do with the difficulty of having a sustained market for faba beans. And when we talk about the markets, we need to think very hard about fostering the domestic side, which is actually bigger than the export side in terms of the usage profile for faba beans. And that certainly needs to be fostered and is the most promising side, I would say, for usage of faba beans going forward. On the export side, we have some very steep competition, especially by Australia into Egypt, which is the biggest market, as we will see, and by the UK and occasionally by France. Whereas on the domestic side, we are seeing some very hopeful signs in terms of including faba beans potentially into the fractioning side. So again, this is the faba bean balance sheet in graph form, which again shows you the volatility in production and supply, but it also shows you a very fickle export market with difficulties competing into some of the destination, whereas we see increasing usage on the domestic side. And I should also point out that over the last 2 years, we are decreasing some of the stocks we have been carrying along, which again is also very good for price considerations. Again, to review the export side, I would say that they're a relatively small part of usage for the Canadian soybeans. There are actually few major buyers, and I'm outlining here the top buyers for us are the United States and then Egypt. And particularly into the Middle Eastern side, we see some solid competition by Australia and by the UK and by France. So I wanted to leave you also with some mental impressions as to how this market stands up. Again, this is the international side. These are exporters of broad beans or faba beans. You can see Australia being very dominant. I circled the space Canada occupies here. It's less than 4%. United Kingdom at about 11% and so on. On the buying side, very centralized, Egypt in excess of 50%, Saudi Arabia and a range of Middle Eastern countries that buy some of these soybeans for edible purposes. There are some others that I think have some promise for us, as in Norway, because that goes into some of the feed rations. And that would be something that lends itself more towards us and our shipping patterns as well. Again, trade trend 2009 forward and the values generated through trade. So you can see Australia on the top and some of the European countries as well, generating value from the export market. And with container freight being very difficult, it will remain difficult for us to break into that. Also, export demand volumes tend to be very, very volatile. As you can see here, most of these countries have some domestic production as well. So again, you know, it is a difficult market to have sustained gains into. Domestic prospects, I think it behooves us to work both on the agronomic and on the demand development side on the domestic side. In terms of acreage for next year, there are a lot of viable commodity options this year, as we saw in the cost of production breakdown I showed you earlier. And faba beans will have to compete with these commodities. And also, it would make it much more easy for farmers to make decisions to grow faba beans if you can do some forward pricing. And I haven't seen any forward prices for 2022 as of yet. In terms of the future, I think there are many agronomic advantages, as you have heard, for faba beans. The high protein content is promising, very, very promising for the fractioning side, both in food and feed applications. So there's a lot of interest for industry, but I think farmers need to be shown that interest. And I think companies will need to engage in contracting to increase acres effectively and to stabilize the somewhat volatile production profile we have shown so far. So I hope I'm more or less in time. I know I'm a little bit over, and certainly would be delighted to answer your questions, and I turn it back to Terry.
All right, thanks Marlene for that market report. Please put your questions for Marlene in the question box. We're going to move into our Q&A with Amber Johnson, our Director of Marketing and Communications. With SPG, we've got quite a variety of topics for her. I hope our other speakers join in and turn your webcams on. Looking forward to how Amber manages this. So please proceed, Amber.
Thanks, Terry, and I'll invite Carl back. There he is. Perfect. We've got everyone. Looking forward to bounce around a little bit here to, like Terry said, a few different topics that we'll be covering in this Q&A for kind of the latter half of our day. Just a reminder, please get your questions in for Marlene, Patrick, Sherri, and Carl to cover all topics we've covered in the second half of the morning. Sherri, maybe we'll start with you and we'll backtrack a little bit back into kind of the on-farm topics today. Question for you is, what is it going to take to get growers back to considering soybeans, to have soybeans as a steady part of rotations in the province and account for some higher volume of acreage? What do you think is needed to be successful there?
First off, I think it's a mindset. I know there's an awful lot of crops that can be grown here in Saskatchewan, and I do know a few years ago everybody got really excited and our soybean acres soared and everybody planted them, and then we sort of had a crash because we didn't get our moisture in July and August. And I think people have to be willing to look on the varietal developments that have occurred. And like I said in my presentation, guys that tried them 10 years ago had a crash. Absolutely have that mindset of, oh no, I'm not going there. And I think that they need to just be willing to look outside the box and understand that there's been a lot of varietal development here in Saskatchewan. We've got some fantastic breeders up there at the U of S, and understand that they just need to revisit it. And then when they do revisit it, really look at their agronomics. You know, did I use the right inoculant? You know, did I get it planted at the right time? Did I get my plant populations right? There's a lot of people out there giving a lot of advice about soybeans, but very few of them have actually walked a soybean field the number of years that I have. So go to those that know, and I think that we can change that attitude around, because there's a lot of promise, particularly with our protein fractionation plants that we have starting up in this province. There is just such a capability for it to be an outstanding crop. And one thing, I don't remember if I said or not, it's resistant to Aphanomyces. So you need to have that pulse in your rotation, but if you've got an Aphanomyces problem, you know, you got to be real careful with your peas and your lentils. So come back to beans, soybeans.
Can I add to that, Amber?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead, Marlene.
So Sherri, you have to put in another plug for your soybeans as well. So from a marketing point of view, it's a huge market, as you know, and Saskatchewan is ideally located for shipments to the West Coast, as you know, alongside with canola and so on. It goes to the same destination. China is by far the biggest buyer of soybeans. So it's a little bit a question of a chicken and an egg. You have to be big enough that the companies are interested in making it a big program. But certainly the market is there, and you are ideally located in Saskatchewan to participate in that big market. So as the volume grows, I think the marketing programs will grow alongside. In Manitoba, for example, I think we saw, what was it yesterday? I think it was some $16 contracting possible, you know, first going south. But anyhow, it is an attractive crop, and the marketing side is not going to hold you up for long as the volume increases.
Great, thanks addition there, Marlena, and thanks Sherri for that. I'm going to pop on over to Patrick here with a couple questions. Patrick, you mentioned that the evolution of agricultural production has largely happened outside of government regulation. Are there examples of industries whose environmental impact has evolved as a result of government regulation, and does that make their need to communicate positive developments in their industry's environment impact different than what we're facing in agriculture today?
It's a tremendous question, and I'd clarify my position just a little bit. I think the evolution of agriculture, and in particular the use of technology in agriculture, hasn't necessarily evolved outside of government regulation, but I think outside of the, if I can be really honest, I think outside of the understanding of policymakers, I think it has just advanced much more quickly than policymakers. And I had somebody say to me recently, you know, it's not your grandfather's farm anymore. And I don't think that, like, the nuance and the sophistication is appreciated. And that can be an advantage, because that does enable the sector to come along, to the questioner's point, in a really positive way, and say, number one, we're already doing a lot more than you think we are. Let's walk you through it. And number two, we've got expertise that you policymakers should be using as you think about how to further regulate the sector. The question on which sector has done it well, there have been some, I would say, some manufacturing sectors that are considered emissions intensive, where because of the nature of the processes they either use a lot of, for example, natural gas as a feedstock or as a heat, or they're in the processes they use, you know, emissions are reduced that hadn't up till now been perhaps prioritized or adequately captured. And I think as technology has evolved there have been strong and often successful arguments to government. Let's look very carefully at what baselines we're using to measure progress, at what metrics we're using. Let's take a look at some action that has previously been taken, and and let's look at kind of that risk-benefit analysis of what we're making, what it's used for, and where we can at the same time contribute to, again, government's goals on emissions reduction.
Great, thanks Patrick. One more for you here. What would you say are some upcoming environment and climate change policy topics that farmers and the crop sector should be ready to engage with government on really in these next coming months? Kind of what's on that immediate horizon that we need to be aware of?
I think if I can put first a big umbrella out, it's going to be all policies that are in pursuit of this path to net zero that government has announced. And I think I guess the easy answer is anything that helps government move along this path to net zero. Probably more specifically, you know, the fuel standards are going to continue to be really, really important. Opportunities for on-farm emissions reductions, either those that may be possible or those that are already taking place, are going to be really important. And water, I think, separate from that path to net zero, anything around water, as we see this creation of the Canada Water Agency, is something that could be important. And I think agriculture needs to remind government, this sector has been, you know, responsible stewards of the land for a lot longer than it was popular to talk about our need to do things in this space. So I think certainly of all the sectors I work with, agriculture has got the most potential for positive, constructive messaging. But I think, again, to the questioner's point, there are so many policies coming up in this space. I think just what's most important is grabbing a seat at the table and being a constructive partner in these conversations.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Shifting gears again here over to Carl on breeding. What would you say, Carl, what do you forecast will happen to levy in light of potential income from royalty sharing in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's certainly one that we have given some thought to. Breeding and variety development are quite a long-term game, and it's difficult at this point for us to forecast what those future revenues from that stream might be. I just want to make it clear, though, like, our goal here is not necessarily for, you know, revenue from, you know, from breeding royalties or whatever it might be to be a, you know, be a huge revenue generator for SPG. It's more of a principle of, if we are going to invest grower levy dollars and growers are going to pay royalties for access for those varieties, then there should be some sharing go back to really, you know, to producer organization to make that reinvestment. But some of the factors that would impact how much revenue we would bring in really depends on what sort of details that we're able to negotiate with breeding and commercialization partners in relation to the, you know, the percentage or the overall amount of funds, grower funds, that we invest as part of those new partnerships. Secondly, uptake of varieties by producers will have a big impact, and how quickly that happens. So, you know, as we regularly do, we'll reevaluate, you know, our revenue needs and our levy rate in relation to into, you know, what we need to do in terms of research investments, market development investments, and other programs going forward. So it'll be more down the road, I guess, for us to try to understand how much revenue we may receive from that, and then, you know, what happens to levy rate following that.
Great, thanks, Carl. Appreciate that. Sherri, back over to you. A pretty somewhat straightforward question. I think you've likely seen it. Just some questions on where someone could find the location of the variety testing site near Melfort to pass that along to people in their network.
I believe if you just Google or go into the varietal trial guide, they have a map there, and I believe that there's might be addresses there, or give your regional crop specialist a call. Everybody has one up there in Tisdale area. It would be Kim Stonehouse. Give Kim a call. He used to work for Melfort. He's very familiar with the site, so he can certainly give you the contact information.
Great, thanks, Sherri. No more questions coming in from the group here, so we do have a little bit of time. Does anyone have any final words you kind of want to leave anyone with today? Not to put you on the spot, but we have a few minutes. Otherwise, we can wrap up a bit early here. Seeing none, we can move on. I'll pass things back to Terry then to close us off with a few final words. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone for those great questions. That concludes our program for today. We hope that you have found this meeting informative and of value to you, and we thank you for joining us. We had over 120 people at one point. We really do appreciate the opportunity to engage with growers, albeit virtually, but still be able to interact with presenters in this format. We hope to be able to be in communities again soon. We'll have to play that by ear a bit. As soon as it's viable to connect with you in person, stay tuned for emails from SPG on information on future events. We'd once again like to thank and recognize our generous sponsors for our session today: Bayer, Next is BioAg and Syngenta. Thank you for supporting this virtual session and pulse growers in Saskatchewan. You will receive an email with a survey about this event, and we would appreciate if you could take a few minutes to fill it in and let us know what you liked and how we can improve future meetings like this. If you want more presentations like this, you can find replays from last week's Winter Pulse meeting on our website, saspulse.com, and there are a few other sessions that will be posted after they're held. I'd like to thank our staff for doing a great job of putting this together. It really was timely topics and well done. And if you're interested in becoming a director, there will be a contest this fall. So please feel free to reach out to me at Nippon or any other director and have a chat about what's involved in being a director. Have a great afternoon. Be well. Let's look ahead and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.